Brad Vanstone from the UK originally. I moved to Amsterdam 5 years ago, and on moving here I started to eat a mainly plant-based diet. Found it really easy to give up meat and milk, but not cheese. And so I searched high and low markets and supermarkets for good alternatives and just couldn't really find any. And so I started to experiment at home myself, and was doing that for about 6 months. And then after 6 months had some initial recipes, and then kind of took it from there. Just started selling it really low key here in Amsterdam, just stores and markets. And then after about a year, realized there was a massive gap for doing this at a bit more scale. And that's kind of what we've been doing the last couple of years. So actually the name originates from my grandparents' dairy farm. So we always say it was established Willicroft in 1957 and then reimagined in 2018, which is when I started it here in Amsterdam. But our main focus is to obviously make a delicious product first and foremost. I think any food product has to taste delicious as a starting point, but then to actually deliver genuine impact, because I think there's been a lot of excitement and some brilliant products come through that are plant-based over the last few years, but the degree to which they're lowering emissions is, can be questioned. And so we're really focused on actually really providing an alternative that massively cuts down on emissions, because cheese as a category is the third largest highest emitting food category. The emissions of all the cheese we eat here in Europe is the same as Belgium's emissions as a country, just to give you some context. So it's crazy. And then the final thing which we're moving into now is doing both of those things at scale, because we believe we've got some great alternatives that can really become a leading sort of product in the plant-based cheese space. But we would only be comfortable going out there if we got those first two parts right, that taste, that impact. So that's our core focus. It starts with measuring emissions. So that's something which we only actually finalized a couple of months ago. So until you know what your emissions are, of course you are making estimations as the degree to which you're making impact. So I would say that is absolutely number one. But we already had some initial ideas before we finalized that, and actually we used cashews as a base for our first two and a half years. And actually we found out that some of our cashew-based cheeses were higher in emissions than the dairy cheese we were replacing, which is crazy. Now you can argue, well, the water might have been different, or there's less animals involved, or that kind of, you can argue those factors, but the emissions were definitely a big reason for switching. And so we then spent basically about 18 months switching the recipes, and have moved on to beans and pulses. So now with the beans and pulses, what we can do is we can grow them locally. And actually this year we're growing 1 hectare of beans here in the Netherlands with a farmer. And then we can also massively reduce the emissions. So on average, we've halved our emissions. We also have a nitrogen fixator now, because beans are one of the best things at fixing nitrogen. And in this part of the world, we've got a massive nitrogen issue. And they're actually a lot more cost effective as well. And price is important. We can't have super expensive products that only a few people can buy. So it's really helped us across the board. But it all started with measuring. And then, of course, when you measure, you got to, I think, enact upon it. It's easy to sweep these things under the carpet, and this is what big food does all the time. It just kind of ignores what's in front of it. But for us, there's only one way of doing it. I'd rather run a business that's impactful than running a business that was creating high emissions, for sure. Even if it varied the success, I'd much rather have a smaller bean-based company than a massive cashew-based one. Although I think we can make it big. I think the main motivation was just understanding that it was actually, as an individual, the biggest thing I could do and that I could control. It was hard, for sure. I think the cheese part especially. Even sort of 4 or 5 years ago when I did it, the meat and milk replacements were really good. and they've also come on even further. So I found that bit a bit easier, and actually we don't really eat meat replacements that much at home. I think it just transitioned our diets into other categories. So we eat a lot more Asian food now, or have different cuisines than we had probably in the past. I don't profess to be perfect at all, but now we've got a dog, we drive everywhere, we get the train as much as we can, still flying a few times a year, so would like to reduce that. Also just where we're buying our products as well, so we get our most of our veg throughout the summer and autumn from a CSA just outside the city. We have renewable energy for our home. Try not to buy too much. And if we do, make sure it can last or it's secondhand. You know, as I said, still probably consuming more than we should, still probably not perfect in those areas, but I think chasing perfection sets you up for failure. So I think it's doing the best you can, and constantly trying to reflect upon it and improve it is the best we can do. Yeah, I think there's more crossover than it might be obvious. So I think firstly their intention was, you know, they were trying to solve what they saw as the biggest issue of the time, which is a big food issue. And right now I think the biggest issue facing us, other than this awful war in Ukraine, is the climate problem. So I think there's definite synergy there. I also think the type of farm they try to create, they firstly worked with the whole community. My grandpa set up this company called Mole Valley Farmers, which was basically like a bulk buying sort of community where they'd all share tools, they'd all buy feed, they basically would come together and therefore save a lot of time and costs. So I think that community aspect is something we've tried to do, and then the farm itself, it was really what I think most people think a farm should be. It was very sort of small, and all of the fields were covered with trees and hedgerows, and there was a lot of other wildlife there, a lot of birds and a lot of little creatures in the hedges and stuff, and it's just a beautiful patchwork farm, and a lot of the feed was grown on the land, and yeah, the cows are out on the fields for 8-9 months a year, so it was a beautiful farm. So I definitely take a lot from those values. It's a different version of what they're doing, but I'd like to think that if they were in my shoes today, they'd do what I'm doing, and if I was in their shoes then, I'd do what they did. You do make plant-based cheese in a similar way to dairy cheese, or at least you can make it in a more simplistic version, but essentially the first thing you're starting with is to make a milk. That's the basic sort of building block of any cheese. And then from there, a dairy cheese will then use things like casein and rennet to basically form the cheese. And there's a convageration that takes place. We don't have casein because that comes from the inner lining of the stomach. So that's where we have to use different binding agents or starches, basically things to form the cheese. We then adding certain flavorings. So for something like our fondue, we have a culture that we make. But for some of our younger cheeses, actually, we use ingredients that are fermenting, so certain yeasts or certain miso ingredients. And then from there, you make the final structure. So we'll put it generally into a big block, or if it's a sauce, it's a bit different. But the things like the feta and the gouda that we make, we'll put it into a giant, it looks like a block of gold, and then from there it will go into whatever shape it needs to. So at the moment we're just grating it, or we're creating sort of 150 gram pieces of feta, but we will also start slicing it quite soon and cubing it, and yeah, you can kind of do anything with a block like that. So there's definitely crossover in the process. It's a much quicker process than making dairy cheese, because there's not too many companies that are aging for no one is aging for the periods of time that you would age a Gouda or a cheddar, but there's crossover for sure. Yeah, I think there are some obvious ones that I think most people are aware of. Like, for example, I think seasonality, eating locally, we really should encourage more of this. I think we all need to improve our knowledge of where things are coming from and what the true cost is. And I think the true cost part is where I see the biggest gains, because at the moment, most of the foods industry is totally underfunded. There's someone who's getting hit somewhere along the chain, and usually that person is either the end consumer or the farmer, but often the producers in between. And there's a lot of people making huge amounts of margin, and the prices that we pay for things are not a fair reflection of the input. So we just literally pay the monetary price at the moment. We don't pay for the social implications of something or the environmental implications. The only exception would maybe be things like regenerative or organic labels. So I would massively change that to then change our consumption. And actually, it's not overly complex. You can do it by having things like carbon taxation. So if, for example, like a category like cheese, there was a threshold of how much carbon you could emit, and if you went above it, you were taxed here. If you went beyond that, you were taxed there, etc., etc. Everyone's got a threshold. And what I like about that system is you could still be a dairy farmer and be below it and not be taxed. It doesn't just say, right, it's plant-based, no tax. It incentivizes everyone. So I would do that massively. And I think we do need to see things like carbon labeling on products as well. But I think that's the easiest, or it's not easy, but that's, to me, like the most effective method that we can make quite a bit of change. I think often those other products they're not the hero in the dish. So something like milk, it accompanies your coffee, and yes, you can probably tell the difference between certain milks, but I think very few people say, oh, that's really good milk in their coffee or in the cereal. I mean, I don't know, I didn't say that. And then the same with meat, other than maybe a steak or something very high end. Chicken, pork, it's really a filler, and it adds texture, it gathers flavor, whereas cheese is it's scientifically proven to be a drug in terms of how people are kind of drawn to it and how people are drawn back to it. But also it just adds so much flavor, and it can really lift a flat dish. So I think people have been reluctant to change it, firstly because maybe the animal suffering isn't as clear as with meat. People maybe have it in their minds that, there's animals that are still having a really nice life, and yes, you could say that for maybe 10%, but generally speaking, no. But also I think it is just such an important part of people's dishes, and they can make peace with going vegetarian but not going that whole hog. And so for us, it's about getting that first step nailed, because I mean, our team actually, we are the same in the sense of we are very conscious people, but I think something has to be of a good standard in order for us to switch something for a long period of time. Very few people are going to just change purely on values. You need to basically remove the barrier, and the first barrier is taste. I think people can get comfortable with paying a little bit more, but taste is so key. So that's what we're trying to do, is replace that taste. And I think what we've tried to say with opening up, new possibilities, is that one day we might actually divert away from what cheese is perceived to be right now. Like maybe we might make something that is totally, just a new version of it. So that's the exciting thing about this, is that we're replacing things for now, but in 5 years, maybe we'll go a step further. I think the climate is really becoming very different every year. Dutch farmers, for example, here might have a drought one year, and then the next year there's too much moisture, and we're just finding that with the bean planting we're starting this year, is that it's almost impossible to predict what yield we're going to get. If it rains a lot, we could literally get half a ton. If it is a really sunny summer, we get 3 tons. So the farmer needs to have a system where they aren't just paid for the yield, but they're given some kind of average amount exactly that means that in a good year they don't get over rewarded, but in a bad year they don't also end up with nothing. And I think money is still such a massive problem with most farmers. It's still a very it's just very hard to make it profitable unless you go really big. And the big farms tend to spray, they tend to use really industrial practices, and we need to start thinking about yields over 10 years rather than 1 year. When you look at yields over 10 years, you can then explore things like regenerative practices and you see a steady increase. Whereas if you look at a yield in a year, sure, you spray it and you adapt it and you can get an amazing yield, but you won't get that for more than 40 years. And I think there's a stat that something like 25% of the world's current farmland won't be farmable in about 10 years' time. It'll be desertified and that topsoil is gone. So that is another massive problem we need to change, is we need to savour that topsoil, and we need to do regenerative farming at scale. And then finally the payment part is key to this as well. Those I think would be the biggest things I would highlight with farming. Yeah, I have very mixed views about what they're doing at the moment. In short, it's not subsidized and they're not doing enough, but they are doing the classic government thing of they've made a policy and it's very overarching and it doesn't really get to the root cause. So one of the things they've done is they've put 25 billion aside to encourage dairy farmers or to stop dairy farmers from farming, but that does nothing to actually switch them onto other forms of crops or encourage them to do other things. So for example, this bean farmer that we're working with, this should be subsidized because we are helping a farmer grow a new crop which they can grow for decades to come, and we're a plant-based company that is part of the transition, which is what the government is talking about. But instead all they're doing is buying up dairy farms with this 25 billion euro pot. Now that amount of money is incredible, it's a huge amount of money fast, but it's just misdirected. And if you look at subsidies globally, 90% of them go to schemes that are creating more emissions than they're actually capturing, which makes no sense. The whole idea of a subsidy is to encourage good practices. But it all stems from the Second World War, and it was all set up here in Europe to basically get farmers really on track. And so well-intentioned, poorly executed is the general rule with government food policy. And 1/3 of the EU's budget still goes to dairy farming. 1/3. It's absolutely obscene. I mean, I would still question if we are a sustainable business because we still emit more than we capture. But I think maybe in the first 5 years you have a bit of leeway and you can say, are you measuring your emissions? Do you have a plan to get to that point of net positivity? Then, okay, maybe that's sustainable. A company that's 5 years older, I think, unless you have a plan to get to that point of net positivity as well, then I wouldn't classify something as sustainability. I think the word sustainable to me means longevity, and longevity is only comes about with something that's holistic and circular. And in our business, what that looks like is net positivity, like going beyond that point of capturing more emissions than we do, and then any waste streams, making sure we're reusing them, remodeling them. It's a very, very kind of basic understanding of or interpretation of that. Yeah. We just think that the current values of companies, the current kind of governance structures just don't make a lot of sense. It's all there just to make profit. The only stakeholders that are considered are customers and investors. They're important stakeholders, but so are farmers, so are other people along the chain. And so by having Mother Nature as your CEO, you're basically saying, well, above all else, I make planetary decisions before any others, and that's the very kind of simple interpretation of what that means. And what we wanted to do is actually see if other people shared that mindset. And so last Earth Day we put a big kind of campaign together and just asked a load of other companies, and now we've got 15 companies that also have made that appointment. And for us, what it looks like in practice is you have the appointment, You then, when you have your decision-making structures, impact is always one of the key ones. And then I think you need to be striving for net positivity again. And then you need to be looking at accreditations like regenerative farming, organic, B Corp, those kind of things. I mean, I actually think the 3 pillars we are focused on are really translatable to any plant-based company. So I would say having impact as a number 1 priority, having taste as a number 1 priority, and only then scale is a really good starting point. I think in terms of general sustainability, I think everything starts with measuring emissions. So I would say anyone who wants to make their company be more sustainable or wants to join something that they aren't sure, are they sustainable? I would say, okay, are they measuring their emissions? Because only then can you make a judgment on whether or not that's the case. We had a really nice reaction. Like, I think there's always going to be a few people who are like, plant-based is, it's horrible. It's not tasty. But I would say people here, I like the Dutch mindset of, okay, I'm not going to make an opinion or a full opinion until I've tried something. And actually, once I've tried something, I am open to changing my opinion. In the UK, for example, where I'm from, if someone has a decision made, very rarely will they adjust it. They really stick to it. So I think people are pretty open here. This is also, I mean, if this doesn't work in Amsterdam, where's it going to work, No, everyone's been pretty receptive, I must say. And one of the beautiful things about having this store is the response we've had from this area. So one is definitely taste. I think a lot of people just presume it can never taste good, and it can be really fantastic. But I would also say people presume that it is much better for the environment, and that is not a good presumption from both the people running those businesses, but also consumers. So I really hope that the sector kicks on from here, because we should question it just like we question dairy. Shouldn't get a free ride. So I'm a little bit critical of that part, I must say, because I think people ignore that the same way big dairy has ignored its part in this whole picture. There's no point of solving one problem and creating another. It just doesn't make any sense. I would say we've just released our new fondue. It's bean based, and we've started to make it with the Gouda. So I've still been having the fondue because it's a little bit wintry, and it is so good. So it's the classic fondue recipe we have, just with a white wine, but then also adding the grated Gouda, and it's amazing. But the cheese I use the most is the Greek white, because it just lifts any dish. It just gives so much flavor. So yeah, maybe not the most inspiring recipes there, but yeah, a few options.